In this session, we're going to look at the myotomes and dermatomes of the upper limb. The word myotome in a limb simply means the nerve root that supplies one or a group of muscles. Perhaps for a neurologist, much detail is needed, but for us, we can just simply look at the main reflexes in the limb. In this first image, I've included the leg, and you'll see why when I tell you that an easy way to remember the myotomes is by starting in the lower leg with the ankle reflex as being S1-2. We then pass to the patellar ligament reflex, which is L3-4, and then to the biceps reflex in the arm, which is C5-6, and then finally to the triceps reflex, which is C7-8. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The groups of muscles that these reflexes apply to will be obvious to you if you've studied the arm and leg in any detail. Now let's turn to the dermatomes. Again, a dermatome simply describes the nerve roots that supply a particular area of skin. Because the brachial plexus contains the roots of C5, C6, C7, C8 and T1, these will be the roots which we'll encounter in the upper limb. In the medical and anatomical literature, very accurate maps can be found showing the exact dermatome for any particular part of the limb. However, we know that there is considerable overlap between the dermatomes, so that for most purposes we can approximate the dermatomes in the way that we'll show here. In this image we're using small hands to illustrate whether the dermatome is anterior or posterior. So let's start in the lower neck with the C4 roots, which are represented in the supraclavicular nerves which come from the cervical plexus. On the lateral side of deltoid, we have the root C5 represented by the upper lateral cutaneous nerve of arm, which comes from the axillary nerve. Inferior to this, but well before the elbow, is the lower lateral cutaneous nerve of arm from the radial nerve, which is C5 also. Then when we come to the lateral side of the forearm, we have the C6 root, which is the lateral cutaneous nerve of forearm, and that comes from the musculocutaneous nerve. Over the thumb itself, on the anterior surface, is still C6, but it is now from the median nerve and posteriorly from the radial nerve. A rather indefinite area over the middle finger and to both sides of it is C7, represented by the palmar and digital branches of the median and ulnar nerve. Posteriorly, on the dorsum of the hand, we've already said that there's some C7 from the radial nerve. And then medially on the base of the hand, and perhaps extending a little above the wrist, is the root C8, which is in the ulnar nerve, and the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm, which comes from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus. A little bit further up the arm on the medial side is the root T1, represented by the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm. Then up to the elbow, and including it on the medial side, continues as T1 as the medial cutaneous nerve of arm. Not shown on this image, but further up into the axilla, there is some T2 root from the intercostobrachial nerve. On the posterior aspect of the upper limb, there is the posterior cutaneous nerve of arm. Posteriorly, on the arm, it is the posterior cutaneous nerve of arm from the posterior cord, and below the elbow, there is some supply by the posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm. Now, we said earlier that there is considerable overlap between the dermatomes, but if you look carefully at this image, you'll see that C6 on the lateral side, abuts T1 on the medial side, and when the dermatomes are not contiguous, as they are in many areas, there is what we call an axial line. Clinically, this is rather important because if we're testing for sensation, we can go from a contiguous dermatome to another contiguous dermatome, and we would expect some overlap. But when you jump between dermatomes which are not contiguous and across an axial line, you would not expect to find any overlap at all. So finally, let's look at the cutaneous nerve supply of the hand. Basically, the distribution of sensation is shown here as between the ulnar, the median, and then on the dorsal side, much of it is the radial, but the radial does not include the nail beds, and it does not include the medial dorsal side, which is supplied by a branch of the ulnar nerve. Let's first look at the ulnar nerve on the palmar side. Before the ulnar nerve passes through the canal of Guyon, which lies anterior to the flexor retinaculum, it gives off a dorsal cutaneous branch, and we can see this extending around onto the dorsal surface as the dorsal cutaneous branch of the ulna. It's supplying 1.5 fingers on the dorsal side, and then a little bit after this, from the ulnar nerve, emerges the palmar cutaneous branch of the ulna, which supplies the skin over the hypothenar eminence. The superficial branch of the ulnar nerve appears in the region of the metacarpal heads on the palmar side, and then supplies the skin on the palmar side of the 1.5 fingers on the medial side. Then if we look at the median nerve, the most important thing to note is that a branch comes off the median at a variable distance above the flexor retinaculum, passes over it to supply much of the skin over the thenar eminence. This important branch is called the palmar cutaneous branch of the median, and it is importantly spared in the carpal tunnel syndrome. The main median nerve continues, of course, in the carpal tunnel and emerges distal to its palmar branch to supply the digital branches to the 3.5 digits on the palmar side and the nail beds of 3.5 digits on the dorsal side. And then we can look at the distribution of the cutaneous branch of the radial nerve. It's called the superficial branch of the radial nerve. It emerges on the dorsum of the hand, just posterior to the tendon of brachioradialis, and passes over the tendon of extensor pollicis longus, and then supplies much of the dorsum of the hand that is not supplied by the ulnar nerve. Note again that the nail beds of the 3.5 fingers on the lateral side are supplied by the median nerve. So it just leaves us to explain the meaning of an autonomous area. Because of overlap between nerves, if a nerve is destroyed, then you do not get numbness throughout its distribution, but you will always get numbness in its autonomous area. And the autonomous areas for testing of the ulnar nerve are over the pulp of the little finger, for the median nerve over the pulp of the index finger, and for the radial nerve over the first dorsal interosseous muscle on the dorsal side of the hand. And with that description of autonomous areas, we'll finish this session.